Okay, so this is the second lecture looking at George Gissing and just wanting to sort of repeat a few things in relation to New Grub Street. So as we were saying, Gissing is a chronicler of his time, chronicling the experience of the middle classes, but particular the lower middle classes, and particularly that kind of squeezed group of people who find themselves in the profession of being a clerk. So, although a lot of critics argue that New Grub Street is about journalism, is about fiction, the thing that we were introducing today was this idea of the clerk and the copyist, and really starting to explore those different approaches, the different biases, the different social biases, both our social biases and also those of the time around those different forms. You can also approach Gissing through gendered readings, and I think what was interesting through the seminar discussions was the extent to which we were interested in him as a male writer, both representing female experience, but actually his interest and consideration in particular of his male characters. So both this session and next week's session are focused in on journalism and literary culture. So even at this early stage, start to think about what kind of entry you might do for your first blog assignment. Have a look in the module handbook and see in particular what that section looks like in relation to journalism and literary culture. And start to see if there's something that we've talked about today that interests you, or something in your reading, or something maybe from the kind of the later seminar discussion. I also wanted to go over, rather than talking about Gissing in particular, you'll find I've put a couple of PDFs from the Literary Encyclopedia in the folder for you. They're quite nice, they're quite short, only 1,000 words or so. And they're the kind of entries that I want you to think about when you're thinking about your blog. So a couple of you have been asking about the tone, about the academicness, about how to quote. And I want you to use the examples that I'll put up for you from the Literary Encyclopedia as kind of like a starting point, and a way of you sort of thinking about the assessment in particular. So moving on a little bit further, and I'm sorry just sort of flicking through this, please do look at your own pace. I just wanted to kind of go over some of this material actually on the notion of Grub Street. So as you can see there, and I've clicked the wrong button. Grub Street existed up until about sort of the late 19th, early sort of 20th century, when it became absorbed, if you like, overwritten by Milton Street. So you've got the notion of Grub Street, and you can see if you look closely the very many sort of public houses that kind of existed down there. But Grub Street became a sort of a focal point for journalism, for literary hacks in particular. So in New Grub Street, you have Gissing overlaying some of those previous ideas and previous understandings. So that might be something, that would be a really interesting topic, a really interesting way in to consider kind of representations perhaps of Grub Street and where Gissing is going with this kind of notion of New Grub Street. I was struck talking to some of you today in your use of Kindles and the use of kind of iPads in terms of sort of reading technology, the way in which our current journalistic practice, the notion of the citizen journalism, our use of social media has utterly transformed media and journalism and moved, if you like, the centre of journalism in the UK from Fleet Street, and actually decentered that and given us more of a sort of a democratic party to news and journalistic ideas. So think about the revolution that was going on then in the Victorian sort of publishing industry. Think about some of the changes that were occurring that Gissing in a way is kind of mapping there in his work. So as I said to you earlier on, Alexander Pope's mock epic poem explores this idea of journalism and Grub Street, and the link there will take you through to the free resource, which is Project Gutenberg. So you might want to kind of explore this kind of heritage from here, the 18th century, investigating this idea of Grub Street and how that then relates to the journalists who work there. And as you can see from in Pope's words, he's referring to the ignorance of these journalists as well. These are the two images as well that we were talking about. So Hogarth's The Distressed Poet, which is depicted both in an oil painting and also in an engraving. And you can see, I think, this gives you this performance, if you like, of the woman coming and asking for the bill to be paid. It shows perhaps the relationship between the wife, the sitting at her chores, sitting at her housework, and the poet, the author, looking out of the window and wanting to be anywhere but where he is. And for the more eagle-eyed amongst you, you can actually see that he has a copy above his head of Pope's epic poem. So this is a very deliberate location again with Grub Street. So I hope that this little sort of recap covers some of the areas that we didn't really manage to get into in terms of the lecture. If you're interested, you'll find at the end of the slides that I put a couple of seminar discussion points which you may or may not have got to in your seminar. So we looked at the notion of dress in relation to the novel, and that might be something you want to think about, the ways in which clothing actually depict wealth. They depict an identity, they depict a social identity as well. So even if you've experienced sort of different seminar questions, you might want to sort of reflect on these and see if there's something of interest there in relation to your blog posting. All right, that's all for this week. Next week we're going to look at a story of a modern woman, so make sure you've got that read in advance of the seminars. Any questions, just get in touch, and don't forget you can always use my office hours, Mondays at 11 and Tuesdays at 3.